So how you doing there, Luke?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. Right, about 20 years ago, maybe 18 years ago. Yeah, about 18 years ago. Sounds. I used to work for a company called European Collections and Investigations. They were based in New Malden, but since I left, I know they relocated their offices to Surbiton. Now, I used to work in the investigations department, tracing debtors, i.e. people who hadn't paid their mortgages or whatever a debt, all sorts of debts. Now, companies that would use us to trace people who had absconded, who no longer lived at the address that they had originally given for whatever debt they'd run up. So basically these people would move on, they wouldn't pay their debt, so it was my job to find out where they were living, if they were working or not, or maybe they were on benefits, and to basically supply these companies with the new address where the debtor had moved to, and it was nice for them to know were they working, were they not. But essentially the main thing was to find out where they were living, so obviously they could write them letters and hassle them for money. Now, I never used to phone up and say who I was and that I used to work for a debt collection agency. The way to find people usually is 95% of the time, the way you find people and trace people is through their national insurance number. Now, through a national insurance number, the tax office will know your tax code, and your tax code is relevant to the company you work for. Okay, so I would find out. I could phone up the tax office posing as the debtor, find out my tax code, and then just find out that tax code. I could find out where they were working. I would then phone up their personnel department, pose as the tax office, saying I needed an address. But basically, I used to phone up all sorts of organisations, and I was never honest about who I was. Most of the time, I was posing as a debtor. So I'd have their information. Obviously, you'd have certain information of them, like their name, their date of birth, their last known address. Sometimes you'd have their national insurance number. There was one I used to use, Cedar Holdings, which was like a mortgage company. I always used to have their national insurance number on that, but sometimes I'd have to try and obtain their national insurance number. Very easy, you just phone up the tax office pretending to be that person, and funnily enough, if it was, say, Mrs. Smith who I was tracing, I'd just phone up and pretend I was Mr. Smith, and they'd still give me the national insurance number. Right, so basically none of this was legal. They knew it was illegal, but they'd do it anyway, because you know, if you phone up the last known address and say someone was living at their mother's house and you asked where they were living, most of the time no one's ever stupid enough to give the address out. It just doesn't happen. I mean, it does occasionally. I mean, I did blag things occasionally, but most of the time you needed to be the debtor, pretend to be the debtor, and people would give you information. And this was, I remember when I was doing this, the Data Protection Act was just sort of getting up and running. So all this was in place. You know, Data Protection Act was you know, enshrined in our law while we were while I was working. I mean, I only did this job for about a year, and I soon realised how immoral it was, you know. But I needed a job. I just moved out, you know. I was 18. I needed a job.
So how much do you know how much a company was being paid to get this information?
I think it was something like they charged £50 for
every detail.
just for obtaining the address. Then obviously they'd chase the debtor for the money, and they'd take a percentage of the debt or something like that.
Because you're saying a company is called a tracer.
Yeah, I was called my job title was telephone tracer.
Because the conversations I've had with a couple of companies trying to get money from me, which they can't pay, which they can't prove that the money does exist, they did admit to me that they got the details through a tracing company.
A tracing company, right? Well, a tracing company will use all sorts of dubious illegal means to obtain. Basically, it's you know, it's the Data Protection Act. I'm not supposed to phone up and pretend to be anyone other than me to try and get information. But you know, what do people on the phone do? They say, can you confirm your name, address and your date of birth? So of course you've got all this because they've written it on the application form, so they supply you with this information. So I can say I am Mr. Smith. I was born on the 10th of October 1980. I mean, I knew all that. So it would obviously be the same details as what they had, so then they'll talk to you. But some people give out the information quite easily, you know. But yeah, it's the national insurance number they're after. Once they've got that, then right. Another thing I'll do. I mean, if someone was on benefits, say someone was getting job seekers allowance or whatever, I would phone up. I would phone up the job centre. I would pretend to be the debtor. I would give my name, my address, my national insurance number. I would pretend that I hadn't received my GIRO. They would say, well, your account's live, we've sent it out. I'd say, well, where have you sent it? They'd give me the address. I'd go, okay, I don't seem to have it. Okay, well, thank you very much, and I put the phone down. And that's how it all worked.
All right.
And it was completely illegal, and they knew it. And another thing I will say is I know for a fact that occasionally the police used to use our tracing department as well, because they weren't allowed to, you know, be naughty like that, but they knew we would be. So sometimes, but I don't know. I mean, I don't know who these people were, and it was a very rare occurrence. So they must have. But occasionally, the managing director would come along, and the guy sitting opposite me, who was really good, he was sort of like the top tracer in the place. Sometimes the managing director would come along, place a bit of paper on his desk, and say, you're working on that all day, and there was some money in it for him as well. But I know for a fact it was the police that were using the tracing department, hush hush, on the quiet, no one knows about it. You know what I mean? They would never admit to that.
Unreal.
Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, maybe these people were, you know, I mean, you know, for murdering, raping kids or whatever. But I don't know why the police got, you know, obviously I'd never ask any questions, and it was never given for me to do. But I know because I sat opposite the guy who used to do it. But I will swear on my baby's life that is true. The police used to use this as well, but only very occasionally. And I like to think for, you know, someone who really, really needed to be found because they've done something really, really naughty. You know what I mean? So, you know.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much,
That's
Luke.
right.
And that information is extremely valuable. You do not know how valuable that information is.
That's all right. That's all right.
Thank you very much.
That's all right, mate.
Cheers. Thanks.